They called her library girl, too quiet, too soft-spoken, too bookish to survive the most brutal military training program on Earth. While other SEAL trainees shouted orders and flexed their strength, she moved through drills like a ghost, barely noticed, constantly underestimated. The instructors gave her days before she'd quit. Her fellow recruits made her the punchline of every joke. But when a multinational crisis erupted and encrypted messages flooded the command center in 7 different languages, everyone froze except her. What she did next didn't just shock the colonel, it left the entire base speechless. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to join us in honoring the quiet warriors who never ask for recognition. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a gun, it's silence. The sun hung merciless over the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, turning the obstacle course into a proving ground of dust and sweat. Trainees moved through tire runs and rope climbs with grunts that echoed across the compound, each man pushing his body past what seemed possible. Among them, barely visible in the chaos of straining muscles and shouted encouragement, moved Isla Ravenko. She wasn't fast, she wasn't slow. She was simply there, completing each movement with mechanical precision that drew no attention. Her dark hair stayed pulled tight against her scalp. Her pale skin showed no flush of exertion, and her expression remained as blank as unmarked paper. While others collapsed at water stations gasping for air, she walked calmly to refill her canteen, took 3 measured sips, and returned to position. Trainee Kowalski noticed her first that morning, or rather, he noticed how utterly unremarkable she appeared. He was built like a linebacker, all shoulders and confidence, the kind of man who'd been told his whole life that he was destined for this. He elbowed the trainee beside him and jerked his chin toward Isla. Hey, does library girl even sweat? Or does she just annotate the pain? Laughter rippled through the group like wind through tall grass. Several trainees turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from amusement to mild pity. Isla didn't react. She finished securing her rope, checked the knot twice with fingers that moved like they were following a manual, and began her climb. Her movements were efficient, economical, devoid of the aggressive energy that characterized everyone else. From the observation tower, Instructor Gaines lowered his binoculars and turned to his assistant. Gaines had been running Bud-S candidates through hell for 15 years, long enough to recognize patterns in human breaking points. He'd seen the loud ones who burned out by week 2, the overconfident ones who discovered their limits during Hell Week, and the quiet ones who either surprised everyone or simply vanished one morning without explanation. Ravenko, he said, his voice carrying the gravel of 1,000 shouted commands. How long you think she lasts? His assistant, a younger instructor named Torres, consulted his clipboard. End of Hell Week, maybe sooner. She's in week 3 and she's already invisible. The ones who don't make an impression usually don't make it through. Gaines nodded slowly, his eyes tracking Isla as she completed her climb and descended with the same unsettling calm. Shame. Quiet ones either surprise you or disappear. Nothing in between. The training day stretched into evening, each hour marked by new tests of endurance and will. Isla moved through them all with the same ghost-like presence, neither excelling nor failing, simply existing in a space that seemed separate from the intensity surrounding her. Other trainees formed bonds during rest periods, sharing stories of why they'd volunteered for the hardest military training in the world. Isla sat apart, her water bottle in one hand, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the compound walls. When the sun finally released its grip on the base and evening brought merciful coolness, the trainees filed into the mess hall. The room filled with the sounds of exhausted men, grateful for food and a chance to sit down. Trays clattered, chairs scraped, and conversations buzzed with the particular energy of people who'd survived another day of deliberately designed misery. Isla took her tray to a corner table, the kind that seemed to exist in every cafeteria, specifically for people who preferred solitude. She arranged her food with the same methodical care she brought to everything else, then reached into her cargo pocket and pulled out a book. The cover was worn, the pages dog-eared, and the text printed in Cyrillic characters that caught the fluorescent light. Trainee Jackson spotted her from across the room. He had a swagger in his walk that came from being good at things his entire life, from high school football to college ROTC to here, where being good was merely the price of admission. His Texas drawl carried across 3 tables as he approached with his crew in tow. "Yo, Ravenko, what's that? Russian bedtime stories?" Isla looked up briefly, her expression unchanged. "Ukrainian poetry." "Of course it is." Jackson grinned at his friends, playing to his audience. "Good luck translating your way through Hell Week, sweetheart. Maybe you can write a sonnet about suffering while the rest of us are actually suffering." More laughter followed as they moved away, claiming their own table where the volume immediately increased. Isla returned to her book, her fork moving from plate to mouth with the same measured rhythm as her breathing during morning runs. But a camera focused closely on her hands would have revealed something the trainees missed. There was no tremor, no tension in the tendons, no white-knuckle grip on the fork or tight clutch on the book's spine. She wasn't nervous, she wasn't afraid. She was waiting. The next morning arrived, with the same brutal sun and the same brutal expectations. The trainees assembled in the briefing room, a space designed for tactical planning but currently serving as a classroom for men, learning that intelligence matters as much as physical strength in modern warfare. They filed in with the particular exhaustion of people adapting to chronic sleep deprivation, claiming seats and trying to look alert. Colonel Herrick entered with the bearing of a man who'd spent 30 years earning every decoration on his uniform. His face had been carved by wind and combat into something that resembled granite more than flesh. When he spoke, people listened, not because he raised his voice, but because he never needed to. "Next week, we're hosting Allied Special Forces from 7 nations. He gestured to a screen behind him where flags appeared in sequence. France, South Korea, Poland, Jordan, Brazil, Estonia, Pakistan. You will operate as translators, logistics support, and observers. This is not a vacation. This is diplomacy with teeth." His eyes scanned the assembled trainees, moving across faces with the efficiency of a man cataloging assets. When his gaze passed over Isla, it didn't pause, didn't register her presence as anything worth noting. She was simply part of the collective, another face in a sea of candidates. If you can't keep up intellectually, you will embarrass this command. International relations are built on competence. One mistake in translation, one failure in protocol. And you don't just fail yourself. You fail your country. His pause carried weight, dismissed. Chairs scraped as trainees stood, already discussing the upcoming exercise in hushed tones. The prospect of working alongside elite operators from other nations carried both excitement and anxiety. It was a chance to prove themselves beyond the obstacle course, to demonstrate that they belonged in the broader community of special operations. Isla remained seated as the room emptied. Her eyes stayed fixed on the mission board at the front, where the 7 flags still glowed on the screen. France, South Korea, Poland, Jordan, Brazil, Estonia, Pakistan. Her lips moved slightly, forming words in silence, but no sound emerged. She stood finally when the room had cleared except for a few stragglers and walked toward the exit with her usual unhurried pace. But Instructor Gaines, who'd remained by the door, observing the trainees' reactions to the briefing, found his attention drawn to her. There was something in the way she'd stared at those flags, something that suggested more than curiosity. "Where the hell did they find you, Ravenko?" he muttered to himself, too quietly for her to hear. The days between the briefing and the joint exercise passed in their usual rhythm of controlled suffering. Morning physical training before dawn, classroom instruction on tactics and procedures, afternoon drills that tested everything from marksmanship to underwater navigation, evening study sessions where trainees pored over manuals and tried to absorb information while fighting the gravitational pull of exhaustion. Isla moved through it all like water, flowing around stones, present but separate, involved but isolated. The jokes continued. Library Girl became her unofficial call sign among certain trainees, though never to her face. Others simply forgot she existed, their attention naturally drawn to the louder personalities, the obvious standouts, the men who seemed destined for legend. But if anyone had paid attention during the language preparation sessions, they might have noticed something odd. When the instructor played audio samples of French military communications, Isla's head tilted slightly, as if she were listening not just to the words, but to something beneath them. When Korean phrases were written on the board for pronunciation practice, Her lips formed the sounds with a precision that suggested more than academic study. When the instructor mentioned the complexity of Arabic dialects, something flickered across her face too quickly to name. No one noticed, or if they did, they filed it away as irrelevant data about someone who probably wouldn't last another month anyway. The night before the joint exercise began, the barracks settled into an unusual quiet. Tomorrow would bring foreign officers, international expectations, and the pressure of performing under observation. Some trainees couldn't sleep, staring at ceiling tiles and running through French phrases or Korean greetings. Others fell into the deep sleep of the perpetually exhausted, trusting that their training would carry them through whatever came next. Isla lay in her bunk, surrounded by the sound of breathing and the occasional shift of bodies finding comfortable positions. She waited until she was certain everyone had settled, then reached beneath her pillow and pulled out a small notebook. The cover was battered, the corners bent from being carried in pockets and packs across unknown distances. She opened it carefully, as if the pages contained something precious that might escape if handled roughly. The first page showed a date from 3 years ago and a location that most Americans couldn't find on a map without help: Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The handwriting below was small and precise, documenting phrases in Pashto alongside English translations and the tactical notes. She turned pages slowly, revealing more dates, more locations, more languages. French observations from Djibouti, Korean terminology from a joint exercise she wasn't supposed to have witnessed, Arabic dialects from somewhere in the Middle East that remained deliberately vague in her notes, Portuguese phrases from Brazil, Estonian technical terms, Polish military slang. Each page was a window into experiences that didn't align with the official story of a trainee in her third week of Bud-S. These were the notes of someone who'd spent years in the field, someone who'd learned languages not from textbooks but from necessity, from survival, from being present in places where understanding the difference between one word and another could mean the difference between life and death. She paused on a page near the middle, her finger tracing a particular entry. The date read 2019. The location was listed as Helmand Province. The note beneath, written in both Pashto script and English translation, described a distress call pattern used by Pakistani special forces when they couldn't communicate openly. It detailed how familial terms could be arranged to convey coordinates, how certain phrases indicated levels of danger, how a seemingly casual message could actually be a desperate plea for extraction. Isla stared at that page for a long moment, her expression unchanged, but her eyes carrying something that might have been memory or might have been preparation. Then she closed the notebook, slid it back beneath her pillow, and lay down with her hands folded across her chest. Sleep came to her the way everything else did, with quiet inevitability and no visible struggle. Around her, future Navy SEALs wrestled with nerves and anticipation. Isla Ravenko simply closed her eyes and let consciousness fade, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different places, waiting for tomorrow to reveal what it would demand of her. The morning of the joint exercise arrived with cloudless skies and the kind of heat that would build steadily throughout the day. The base transformed overnight, now hosting vehicles and personnel from 7 different nations. French officers in their distinctive uniforms moved alongside South Korean special forces. Polish operators compared notes with Brazilian counterparts. Jordanian and Estonian teams set up their equipment with the efficiency of professionals who'd done this many times before. Pakistani special forces arrived last, their presence adding the final piece to an already complex international puzzle. The trainees watched this influx of foreign expertise with a mixture of awe and anxiety. These weren't instructors or fellow students. These were active operators, men who'd seen combat and conflicts most civilians couldn't name, who carried themselves with the particular confidence that came from having survived situations where confidence alone wasn't enough. Isla stood with her group as assignments were distributed. Most trainees were paired with specific national teams to assist with logistics and communication. Isla's assignment came last, almost as an afterthought. Shadow operations. Report to the communications tent. It was the kind of vague instruction that suggested no one had quite figured out what to do with her. The communications tent was command central, where senior officers would coordinate the exercise and maintain contact with all participating units. Trainees weren't usually assigned there. It was too important, too sensitive, too much of an opportunity for an inexperienced candidate to create an international incident through incompetence. But someone had put her name on the roster, and so she went. The communications tent was already chaotic when she arrived. Radio operators sat at their stations, testing frequencies and confirming contact with each national team. Translators huddled near their assigned units, reviewing terminology and protocol. Officers moved between stations, checking readiness and coordinating timelines. The air smelled of electronics and strong coffee, and the ambient noise was a constant wash of radio chatter, keyboard clicks, and low, urgent voices. Isla found a position near the back wall, far enough from the action to be out of the way, but close enough to observe everything. A folding chair sat empty beside a supply cabinet. She claimed it and settled in to watch, her hands folded in her lap, her expression as neutral as ever. No one paid her any attention. The real work was happening at the front of the tent, where Colonel Herrick stood at a large tactical display coordinating the exercise's opening phase. Around him, officers from 7 nations conferred in a mixture of English and their native languages, the conversation flowing between tongues with the ease of professionals accustomed to international cooperation. The exercise began at 0900 hours. Radio traffic immediately filled the tent as units reported positions, confirmed objectives, and began moving through their assigned scenarios. The plan was elegant in its complexity, designed to test how well different national forces could coordinate under pressure, sharing intelligence and adapting to rapidly changing situations. For the first hour, everything proceeded smoothly. The translators kept pace with their assigned units. The radio operators maintained clear channels. Colonel Herrick monitored the tactical display with the satisfaction of a man watching a well-designed plan unfold exactly as intended. Then the complications began. It started small. A French unit requesting air support used terminology that the assigned translator stumbled over, creating a 30-second delay. A Korean team reported a flanking movement, but the translation mixed up direction, causing brief confusion. These were minor issues, the kind of friction inevitable in any multinational operation, but they accumulated like small stones building into a wall. The radio traffic intensified. Multiple units began transmitting simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of languages. French mixed with Korean, mixed with Arabic, mixed with Portuguese. The translators, each focused on their specific assignment, struggled to keep up with the pace. Officers began repeating requests, voices rising with frustration. Colonel Herrick's expression hardened. This was supposed to be a demonstration of seamless cooperation. Instead, it was becoming a case study in the challenges of coalition warfare. He moved between stations, demanding clarity, pushing for faster translations, trying to manually coordinate what should have been flowing naturally. A Polish mechanized unit called in with a route change. The translator took 40 seconds to convey the information, during which the unit had already moved to a new position. A Brazilian team requested clarification on rules of engagement, but the response got garbled in translation, forcing them to wait while the question was asked again. Estonian snipers reported target acquisition, but by the time the information reached command, the target had moved. The tent descended into controlled chaos. Radio operators increased their volume. Translators spoke over each other. Officers clustered around the tactical display, pointing and arguing in 3 different languages. What had begun as an elegant exercise in international cooperation was rapidly becoming a demonstration of everything that could go wrong when communication broke down. From her position against the back wall, Isla remained motionless. Her eyes tracked from station to station, taking in each conversation, each frustrated exchange, each breakdown in understanding. Her head tilted slightly when the French unit transmitted. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly when the Korean team spoke. Her fingers tapped a slow rhythm on her knee when Arabic phrases crackled through the speakers. Colonel Herrick stood at the center of the storm, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. This exercise would be evaluated by officials in 7 different capitals. Failure here meant more than hurt pride. It meant questions about American leadership in coalition operations, doubts about the ability to coordinate when it truly mattered. "Someone get me a clear channel," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. I need confirmation from all 7 units within the next 60 seconds, or we're aborting the entire exercise. The radio operators worked frantically. The translators tried to prioritize. But the problem wasn't effort or dedication. The problem was that 7 different militaries were trying to communicate through a system designed for simpler times, and the humans in the middle were overwhelmed by the complexity. Herrick turned, scanning the tent for solutions that weren't presenting themselves. His eyes swept past officers, past translators, past radio operators, searching for something or someone who could cut through the mess and restore order to chaos. His gaze landed on Isla Ravenko, sitting quietly against the back wall with her hands folded in her lap. She looked completely out of place in that moment, a trainee in week 3 of Bud S, surrounded by seasoned professionals struggling with a problem beyond their collective ability to solve. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then Herrick's frustration boiled over into the kind of snap decision that desperation sometimes produces. He gestured sharply at her. "You, trainee." His voice carried across the tent, causing several officers to turn and look. "You understand any of this?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Every translator looked up. Every radio operator paused mid-transmission. Every officer stopped what they were doing to see who the colonel was addressing and why he was asking such an absurd question. Isla stood slowly, her movements as measured as ever. She walked forward through the suddenly silent tent, weaving between stations with a confidence that seemed at odds with her status as the invisible trainee everyone had dismissed. She stopped 3 feet from Colonel Herrick, came to attention with parade ground precision, and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried to every corner of the tent. "Oui, mon colonel, cada canal, cul resala, mode un signo, cada transmissão, iga sonum, hier bat." The words flowed from her mouth like water, each language distinct and clear, the pronunciation native and natural, French, Polish, Arabic, Korean, Portuguese, Estonian, Urdu. 7 languages in 7 seconds, each one perfect, each transition seamless. The tent remained frozen in that strange moment where reality hadn't quite caught up with what everyone had just witnessed. Then Colonel Herrick spoke, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Repeat that. If you've ever witnessed someone prove everyone wrong with a single moment of undeniable truth, share that story in the comments below. And if you'd like to see how this plays out, consider subscribing, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show rather than tell." Isla moved to the nearest radio station with the kind of purposeful calm that made experienced operators step aside without being asked. She picked up the first headset, adjusted the frequency with fingers that knew exactly where to go, and began translating in real time with a fluency that turned the chaos into clarity. "French unit, Sector 3, enemy contact confirmed, requesting immediate close air support. Ammunition status at 60%. 2 injured, non-critical. Requesting medical evacuation after engagement concludes." She set down that headset and picked up another without pause, her voice shifting languages like someone changing channels on a television, each transition instant and complete. Korean reconnaissance reports flanking movement from the east, approximately 200 meters from primary objective. 4 hostiles visible, potentially more in concealment. Requesting permission to engage or await additional units. Another radio. Another language. Her accent shifted from the clipped precision of military Korean to the flowing cadences of Arabic without a single stumble. "Jordanian squad confirms visual on target building. Entry points secured. Rules of engagement clarification needed regarding civilian presence in adjacent structures. Awaiting green light for breach." The officers in the tent had stopped trying to work. They stood frozen, watching this trainee they had never noticed systematically decode the multilingual chaos that had overwhelmed their entire operation. Colonel Herrick's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes tracked every movement she made, every word she spoke. Isla continued through the channels with mechanical efficiency. Brazilian operators reporting GPS malfunction, navigating by landmarks, 200 meters from objective and closing. Polish mechanized unit rerouting due to terrain obstacles, new ETA 7 minutes. Estonian sniper team has eyes on secondary target, requesting confirmation before engagement. Pakistani intelligence flagging possible secondary threat in northwest quadrant. Unconfirmed hostiles recommend caution. She set down the final headset and turned to face Colonel Herrick. The entire tent waited for his response. Outside, the exercise continued, units moving through their scenarios, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in the command center. How long have you been fluent? Herrick's question was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. Since I could speak, sir. Isla's answer was equally quiet. I was raised in 7 countries. My father was Dmitry Ravenko, former Soviet intelligence who defected in 1991. My mother was Amara Idris, Somali-American linguist, who trained interpreters for NATO operations. I learned French in Paris, Korean in Seoul, Arabic in Amman, Portuguese in Brasilia, Estonian in Tallinn, Polish in Warsaw, and Pashto in Islamabad, plus Russian, Somali, and 4 other languages, depending on what you count as fluent versus conversational. The information landed in the tent like artillery fire. Officers exchanged glances. Translators who'd been struggling minutes ago now looked at this trainee with expressions ranging from amazement to something approaching resentment. How long had she been sitting there, watching them struggle, saying nothing? Instructor Gaines, who had entered the tent minutes earlier to observe the exercise, leaned against a support beam with his arms crossed. His earlier prediction about Isla either surprising everyone or disappearing suddenly seemed prophetic, though even he hadn't anticipated this particular surprise. Why didn't you mention this during intake? Herrick's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. This kind of capability should have been flagged immediately. We could have utilized you from day one. Because I didn't want to be utilized, sir. I wanted to be tested. Isla met his gaze directly. Every other placement I've had, I was valued for my languages and nothing else. I was kept safe, kept behind desks, kept away from anything that might damage a valuable asset. I came here to prove I could do everything the other candidates do. I didn't want special treatment. So you hid an intelligence capability during a national security screening. Herrick's statement hung between them like an accusation. No, sir, it's all in my file. Complete linguistic profile, family background, previous deployments as civilian, liaison. I didn't hide anything. I just didn't announce it. There's a difference between concealment and not volunteering information that wasn't requested. Before Herrick could respond, a new transmission crackled through the speakers. This one was different from the coordinated chatter of the exercise. The signal was weak, breaking up, and the voice carried an edge that every operator in the tent recognized instantly. This wasn't simulation. This was real. The words came in fragments, distorted by distance and interference. The language was Pashto, but not the standard dialect that translators learned from textbooks. This was regional, specific, layered with terms that suggested the speaker was trying to communicate something beyond the literal meaning of the words. Every translator in the tent moved toward the transmission. They clustered around the radio, listening intently, their faces showing concentration mixed with confusion. One of them, a captain who'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan, tried to parse what he was hearing. It's Pashto, but the structure is wrong. He's using family terms in weird places. Brother, uncle, father. But they don't fit the grammar. I think he's saying something about position or location, but I can't make sense of it. Another translator leaned in. Maybe it's coded, some kind of call sign system, but I don't recognize the pattern. The transmission continued, the voice growing more urgent. In the background, other sounds filtered through. Movement, possibly vehicles. The distant pop of small arms fire. Whatever was happening on the other end of that radio, it wasn't part of the exercise. Colonel Herrick turned to his communications officer. Do we have a Pakistani unit off the grid? The officer checked his screen, scrolling through position reports. Negative, sir. All exercise participants are accounted for and on schedule. Then who the hell is transmitting? The question went unanswered because Isla was already moving toward the radio. She pushed through the cluster of translators with a directness that bordered on aggressive, reached past the captain who'd been trying to decode the message, and turned up the volume. She listened for exactly 10 seconds, her head tilted in that distinctive way she had, as if she could hear not just the words, but the intention behind them. It's not standard Pashto. She spoke without taking her attention from the transmission. It's a Waziristan dialect mixed with Soviet-era code structure. He's using familial terms to hide grid coordinates. The father references latitude, uncle is longitude, brother is elevation. The grammar seems wrong because it's not meant to be grammar, it's a key. The tent went silent except for the ongoing transmission. Isla grabbed a notepad from the nearest desk and began writing as she listened, her hand moving in quick, precise strokes. Numbers appeared on the page, coordinates that meant nothing to most people present, but everything to those trained in. Tactical operations. It's an SOS from a Pakistani Special Forces unit. They're not part of this exercise. They're active operation, somewhere in the tribal regions, and they're compromised. They can't speak freely because hostiles are in auditory range. They're using this old protocol because they know anyone listening who understands will realize they're in immediate danger. She circled a set of numbers on her page. They have 4 minutes before enemy patrol patterns bring hostiles directly to their position. Maybe less if those vehicle sounds in the background are what I think they are. Colonel Herrick stared at the coordinates she'd written. How do you know that? Because I've heard this exact message before. Isla finally looked up from the radio, and for the first time since entering the tent, her expression showed something other than neutral calm. Helmand Province, 2019. Pakistani Special Forces unit pinned down after an intelligence gathering operation went bad. They used this same coded family structure to call for extraction. I was the civilian liaison who translated it. 12 men made it out alive because someone understood what they were really saying. The weight of that statement settled over the tent like heavy smoke. This wasn't a trainee who happened to speak languages. This was someone who'd already been in the field, already saved lives, already operated in the spaces where most people only went after years of training and vetting. Instructor Gaines pushed off from his support beam and moved closer. You were in Helmand in 2019? As what? You would have been, 22, 23, 21. And I was there as a contract linguist attached to joint operations. My mother had died the year before. My father was already gone. I had nothing keeping me stateside and 7 languages that coalition forces needed. So I went where I was needed. The transmission from the trapped Pakistani unit continued its desperate loop. The voice remained controlled, but the urgency underneath was becoming impossible to miss. Time was compressing, seconds ticking away toward a moment when the message would stop because the men sending it would be dead or captured. Isla turned back to Colonel Herrick. Sir, with respect, we don't have time for my biography. If you want that unit alive, I need operational authority. I need direct communication with Pakistani command, access to available assets for rapid response, and coordination with any allied units close enough to assist. And I need all of that in the next 60 seconds. The request was absurd. She was a trainee. She had no rank. She had no official position in the command structure. Everything about protocol and procedure said that Herrick should take her translation, pass it up the chain, and let the people actually responsible for such operations handle it through proper channels. But proper channels took time, and time was the one resource the trapped unit didn't have. Colonel Herrick looked at Isla Ravenko, at this ghost who'd moved through his training program invisible and underestimated, and made the kind of decision that either earned medals or ended careers. Do it. The tent erupted into controlled chaos as Isla moved to the command table. Officers stepped aside, not because they wanted to, but because something in her movement suggested that hesitation would cost lives. She spread the tactical map across the table, marked the coordinates she'd decoded, and began issuing orders with a clarity that transformed confusion into action. All Pakistani exercise units, this is command. She spoke in Urdu, her voice carrying the particular cadence that military communications required. Immediate priority Alpha. We have a hot extraction situation in the tribal regions. Coordinates follow. Need closest units to divert for emergency support. The response came back in seconds. Pakistani Captain Rashid, commanding one of the exercise units, confirmed receipt and reported his team was 40 minutes from the coordinates by ground transport. Too far. Too slow. Isla's mind worked through options with the speed that came from having done this before. She switched to French, contacting the French Special Forces unit participating in the exercise. French tactical, this is command. Emergency tasking, Pakistani unit in critical situation. Your helicopters are closest air asset. Need immediate diversion for combat extraction. Coordinates transmitting now. The French commander hesitated only momentarily before confirming. His birds could be airborne in 8 minutes, still tight, but possible. She moved through languages and units like a conductor directing an orchestra. Korean reconnaissance was repositioned to provide overwatch on likely enemy approach routes. Brazilian operators with medical training were put on standby for casualty evacuation. Estonian snipers were given coordinates for potential enemy positions. Polish mechanized units were moved to secure the extraction route. Every order was precise. Every translation was flawless. Every unit responded not because they understood the full picture, but because the confidence in her voice suggested she did. Colonel Herrick watched from beside the table, no longer directing, but not interfering either. This had become Isla's operation, and everyone in the tent knew it. The other translators stood back, some with admiration, others with the uncomfortable realization that they'd been outclassed by someone they'd considered beneath notice. The tactical display updated as units moved into position. Isla coordinated timing with the precision of someone who understood not just where everyone was, but where they needed to be. The French helicopters launched. The Korean observers reported enemy movement patterns. The Brazilian medical team confirmed readiness. Every piece was sliding into place. She switched back to Pashto, transmitting directly to the trapped Pakistani unit on their emergency frequency. Shpele Zama, extraction inbound. 8 minutes, hold position, stay silent, help is coming. The response was barely audible, just a single click of a transmit button. Acknowledgement without words. They'd heard. They understood. They were still alive. Those 8 minutes stretched like hours. The tent remained silent except for radio updates and the soft click of keys as operators tracked movement on screens. Isla stood at the command table, her eyes moving between the tactical display and the clock, calculating distances and timing with the part of her brain that had learned to see battlefield geometry. At 7 minutes, Korean reconnaissance reported enemy patrol approaching the trapped unit's position from the west. 2 vehicles, approximately 12 hostiles. They would arrive before the French helicopters. Isla didn't hesitate. Estonian sniper team, you have target authorization. Disable lead vehicle, create confusion, not massacre. Buy us 90 seconds. The Estonian team lead confirmed in his own language. 15 seconds later, the radio crackled with the sharp report of a long-range rifle shot. Korean observers confirmed the lead vehicle was immobilized. Enemy patrol was stopping to assess. Clock reset. At 6 minutes, the French helicopters reported visual on the extraction zone. They were coming in fast and loud, using speed and surprise instead of stealth. There was no time for subtlety. Isla coordinated the final approach in 3 languages simultaneously, switching between French for the helicopters, Pashto for the trapped unit, and Korean for the overwatch team. It was a verbal ballet performed at lethal speeds, every word timed to ensure units arrived at the exact right moment in the exact right sequence. The extraction happened in 45 seconds. The French birds dropped in hard, rotors kicking up dust that provided natural concealment. The Pakistani unit ran from their hide position, moving with the controlled speed of professionals who knew that panic killed. Korean observers reported enemy patrol regrouping, but still delayed by the disabled vehicle. Estonian snipers provided covering fire that kept heads down without starting a full engagement. Then the helicopters were up, climbing fast and turning away from the threat zone with the rescued unit aboard. The radios erupted with confirmations and status reports. All personnel accounted for. No casualties. Clean extraction. The communications tent remained silent for a long moment after the last confirmation came through. Everyone present had just watched an operation planned and executed in under 10 minutes, coordinated across 7 different national militaries, commanded by a trainee who wasn't supposed to be anything more than a shadow in the back of the room. Colonel Herrick turned to face Isla. His expression remained difficult to read, but something in his posture had changed. This was no longer an instructor evaluating a candidate. This was a senior officer, recognizing a peer. Before he could speak, the communications officer called out, "Sir, we have inbound. The Pakistani unit is requesting permission to land at this location. They're bringing the rescued unit here?" "Yes, sir. ETA 20 minutes. Herrick nodded slowly, then looked back at Isla. "They'll want to meet you. They already know me, sir." Isla's voice carried neither pride nor false modesty. "I've worked with Captain Rashid's unit before, with several of the Allied teams here actually, just not in any official capacity they could publicly acknowledge." That statement opened another door of questions, but those would have to wait. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the aftermath was just beginning. News of the emergency extraction was already spreading through the base. Trainees who dismissed Isla as library girl were hearing fragments of what had happened in the communications tent. Instructors who'd predicted she'd wash out were being told that she'd just commanded an international rescue operation. The 20 minutes before the helicopters arrived passed in a strange twilight of activity and anticipation. The joint exercise had been officially paused. Units were returning to base for debriefing. Officers from 7 nations were being briefed on what had occurred. And somewhere in that controlled chaos, the story of the quiet trainee was spreading like wildfire through a dry forest. Isla stood outside the communications tent, away from the crowd gathering near the landing zone. She'd slipped out during the confusion, seeking a moment of separation from the attention that was building like a wave. The afternoon sun was starting its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the compound. Instructor Gaines found her there, standing with her hands in her pockets, watching the horizon where helicopters would soon appear. "You should be in there." He gestured toward the command area where officers were gathering. "This is your moment." "This isn't about moments, sir." Isla kept her eyes on the horizon. 12 men are alive who might not have been. That's all that matters. Gaines studied her profile, seeing details he'd missed during weeks of having her in his training program. The way she held herself spoke of experience that had nothing to do with obstacle courses. The calm that had seemed like detachment was actually the stillness of someone who'd already been tested in ways that made Bud S look like preparation instead of proving ground. "How many operations have you been part of?" His question was quiet, just between them, enough to know that the loud ones aren't always the dangerous ones. Isla finally looked at him, and enough to know that being underestimated is sometimes the most valuable asset you can have. The sound of rotor blades reached them before the helicopters became visible. 2 French birds appeared as dark shapes against the afternoon sky, flying in tight formation. Behind them, at a slightly higher altitude, came a 3rd helicopter bearing Pakistani military markings. They'd rendezvoused in the air, the rescued unit transferred to their own nation's aircraft for the final approach. The helicopters descended toward the designated landing zone in a storm of noise and dust. Personnel who'd gathered to watch backed away from the prop wash. The French birds touched down first, their crews quickly securing the aircraft. The Pakistani helicopter followed, settling onto the tarmac with the kind of precision that spoke of experienced pilots who'd done this countless times in far more hostile conditions. The crowd watched as the Pakistani helicopter's door slid open. Captain Rashid emerged first, his combat gear dusty, and his face showing the strain of men who'd been operating under pressure. Behind him came 11 more operators, each one moving with the careful control of people grateful to be alive, but trained not to show weakness. They assembled in formation outside their aircraft, a disciplined line of special forces operators who'd just been pulled from a situation that could have ended very differently. The crowd expected them to report to Colonel Herrick, to follow the standard protocol of rescued personnel, checking in with the ranking officer present. Instead, Captain Rashid's eyes scanned the assembled personnel until they locked onto a single figure standing apart from the main group. His expression shifted into something that might have been relief mixed with respect. He spoke a single word to his men. Then, as one unit, they turned to face Isla Ravenko. The entire base watched as 12 Pakistani Special Forces operators came to attention and rendered a salute that was reserved for those who'd earned it through actions that transcended rank or nationality. The silence that followed was absolute. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was the wind and the slowly spinning helicopter blades winding down. Captain Rashid held his salute for a full 5 seconds, a gesture that carried more meaning than any speech could convey, then lowered his hand and walked directly toward Isla. The crowd parted without being asked. Colonel Herrick watched with an expression that had moved past surprise into something approaching understanding. Rashid stopped 3 feet from Isla and spoke in English, his accent heavy but his words clear. "Miss Ravenko, it is an honor to see you again." The formality of the statement, combined with the obvious history it implied, landed on the assembled personnel like a physical force. This wasn't just a translator who decoded a message. This was someone these battle-hardened operators knew, someone they respected enough to salute first before reporting to anyone else. Colonel Herrick approached slowly, his eyes moving between Rashid and Isla. "Captain, perhaps you can clarify something for those of us who are just now learning about Miss Ravenko's background." Rashid turned to face the colonel, coming to attention out of military courtesy. "Sir, you do not know who she is? Why don't you tell me?" What happened next would change how everyone on that base understood the invisible trainee who'd spent 3 weeks being dismissed as too quiet, too soft, too bookish to survive the program. Think about the people in your life who do extraordinary things without ever asking for recognition, and share their stories in the comments. If this kind of quiet heroism resonates with you, consider subscribing to see how this journey continues, because the truth is often more remarkable than anything we could imagine. Captain Rashid stood at attention before Colonel Herrick, his weathered face carrying the gravity of someone about to reveal information that would recontextualize everything the assembled personnel thought they understood. Behind him, his 11 operators remained in formation, their presence a silent testimony to whatever words were about to be spoken. "She is the daughter of Dmitry Ravenko and Amara Idris." Rashid's voice carried across the landing zone, clear and formal. Her father was a Soviet intelligence officer who defected to the West in 1991, bringing with him information that reshaped NATO's understanding of Eastern European operations. Her mother was a Somali-American linguist who spent 20 years training interpreters for coalition forces, developing protocols that are still used today in joint operations. The crowd listened with the intensity of people realizing they had fundamentally misjudged someone. Trainees who'd mocked her shifted uncomfortably. Instructors who'd predicted her failure stood with arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. Rashid continued, his words measured and deliberate. Isla Ravenko was raised in 7 countries as her parents moved between diplomatic posts and training assignments. By the time she was 12, she spoke 9 languages fluently. By 16, she was informally assisting with translation during her mother's training sessions. By 18, she was being consulted by intelligence services who needed someone who could move between linguistic contexts with cultural understanding, not just vocabulary. Colonel Herrick remained silent, letting Rashid speak, but his posture had shifted into something that suggested he was recalculating every interaction he'd had with the trainee, standing quietly to the side of this impromptu briefing. When she was 21, her mother died. Rashid's voice softened slightly. Cancer. Aggressive. Fast. 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. Her father had already passed 3 years earlier. Heart attack. She had no siblings. No extended family in the United States. So, she did what people with her particular skills do when they have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She went to the places where languages matter most. He gestured toward Isla, who stood with her hands clasped in front of her expression neutral, but her eyes showing something that might have been discomfort with being the subject of this public dissection of her history. Helmand Province, 2019. Rashid's voice took on the tone of someone recounting events he'd personally witnessed. My unit was conducting intelligence gathering in hostile territory. We were compromised. 12 men trapped in a compound with enemy forces closing from 3 directions. We had 1 radio, limited ammunition, and no clear extraction route. We sent our distress call using an old protocol that most translators wouldn't recognize because it requires understanding not just Pashto, but the Soviet-era code structures that some of us old enough to remember still carry in our heads. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the base. More trainees appeared, more instructors, support personnel who'd heard fragments of what was happening and come to witness it firsthand. They formed a loose semicircle around the landing zone, all eyes fixed on Rashid as he continued. The call went out on multiple frequencies. We knew someone, somewhere, might be listening. But we also knew that even if they heard us, they might not understand. The protocol is obscure. The dialect is regional. The chances of finding someone who knew both the language and the code structure were statistically negligible. Rashid paused, letting the weight of those odds settle over his audience. 3 hours we waited in that compound. 3 hours listening to enemy patrols getting closer. 3 hours knowing that our window for extraction was closing, And then, on the radio, in perfect Pashto using the proper response codes, we heard a voice, young, female, American accent underneath the Pashto, telling us that extraction was inbound, that we needed to hold position, that help was coming. He turned to look directly at Isla. That voice belonged to her. She was operating as a civilian contractor attached to coalition intelligence. She heard our transmission, she decoded it. She coordinated with 3 different national militaries to arrange our extraction, and she did it in 90 minutes, which is about 89 minutes faster than most official channels could have managed. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't just someone who spoke languages. This was someone who'd already operated in exactly the kind of high-pressure multinational environment that the base was simulating through exercises. Since then, Rashid continued, Ms. Ravenko has been involved in 47 documented operations as a civilian liaison and translator. She's worked with Pakistani, French, German, Jordanian, South Korean, Brazilian, Polish, and Estonian special forces. She's been present during combat operations in 3 countries that she's not permitted to name. She's translated intelligence that led to the interdiction of 2 major weapons shipments and the location of 17 high-value targets. He let those numbers sink in before delivering the final piece of information. She has saved more lives than most operators will during their entire careers, and she's done it from behind radios and translation terminals, putting herself in harm's way to ensure that the people doing the fighting have the information they need to survive. She doesn't carry a weapon, she carries languages, and in the places where we operate, that makes her one of the most valuable assets in theater. Colonel Herrick absorbed this information with the controlled expression of a senior officer whose entire understanding of a situation had been overturned. He turned to face Isla directly. "Why are you here?" The question was simple but carried layers of meaning. Why would someone with that resume subject herself to Bud S? Why hide that background? Why start over as a trainee when she could have written her own ticket to virtually any position in the intelligence or liaison community? Isla met his gaze without flinching. "Because I wanted to earn the right to be on the other side of that radio, sir. I've spent years keeping other people alive. I wanted to prove I could do what they do, not as support, not as an asset, as an operator." The honesty of that answer resonated across the assembled crowd. This wasn't someone trying to take shortcuts or leverage connections. This was someone who'd deliberately chosen the hardest possible path to prove something to herself, and maybe to the memory of parents who'd spent their lives serving in their own ways. "But you could have told us." Herrick's statement carried a hint of frustration. "We could have utilized your skills from day one." "I didn't want to be utilized, sir." Isla's voice remained steady. "I wanted to be tested. Every other posting, I was valuable because of my languages. I was protected. I was kept away from direct action. I was treated like a resource instead of a person. I came here because this is the one place where everyone starts at the same level, where you either meet the standard or you don't, where there are no shortcuts or special considerations." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I needed to know if I could do this. Not because someone made allowances for my other skills, not because I was useful enough to warrant different treatment, but because I met the same standard as everyone else. That's why I didn't announce my background. That's why I let people call me library girl and predict I'd wash out. Because when I make it through, and I will make it through, it won't be because of what I could translate. It will be because I could do everything everyone else did." The declaration carried weight precisely because it came without arrogance or false humility. This was someone stating a simple fact about her own intentions and capabilities. One of the other trainees, a young man named Chen, who'd been among those making jokes about her, spoke up from the crowd. His voice carried embarrassment and something that might have been respect. "We thought you were weak. We thought you didn't belong here." Isla turned to look at him, her expression softening slightly. "I know. That's what I wanted you to think. Because people fight harder against enemies they underestimate. And I wanted to see if I could succeed even when everyone assumed I'd fail. Not in spite of you. Because of you. Your doubt made me sharper." The response transformed the moment from confrontation into something approaching understanding. She wasn't angry at the people who'd dismissed her. She'd used their assumptions as fuel. Captain Rashid gestured to his men, and they moved forward in formation. Each operator stopped in front of Isla, and each one shook her hand, with the kind of respect the warriors reserve for people who have saved their lives. No words were necessary. The gesture said everything. When the last operator had paid his respects, Rashid turned back to Colonel Herrick. "Sir, with your permission, my men and I need to debrief with Pakistani command, but I wanted to ensure that you understood who you have in your program. She doesn't need this training to be effective. She's already more experienced than half the graduates will ever be. But if she's committed to earning this qualification the hard way, then you have someone exceptional in your ranks." Herrick nodded slowly. "Thank you, Captain. Safe travels." The Pakistani unit returned to their helicopter, the rotors already beginning to spin up for departure. Within minutes they were airborne, climbing into the late afternoon sky and turning toward whatever base would serve as their next staging area. The crowd watched them go, then slowly began to disperse as the immediate drama concluded. But the ripples of what had been revealed were just beginning to spread through the base. Trainees who'd shared barracks with Isla for 3 weeks were re-evaluating every interaction, every dismissal, every assumption. Instructors were having quiet conversations about how to handle a trainee who was simultaneously more experienced than them in certain areas, while still needing to prove she could meet their physical standards. Isla stood alone near the landing zone as the crowd thinned. The sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She looked tired for the first time since anyone had noticed her, as if the weight of having her story told publicly had drained something she'd been carefully conserving. Instructor Gaines approached her with 2 bottles of water, offering one without comment. She accepted it gratefully and drank half the bottle in long swallows. "You know what's going to happen now." Gaines' statement was observation, not question. "Everyone's going to treat me differently." Isla recapped the bottle. "They'll either put me on a pedestal or resent me for not being what they thought I was. Either way, I stopped being invisible." "Is that what you wanted? To be invisible?" "I wanted to be evaluated fairly." Isla looked at him directly. "Invisible was just the cost of ensuring no one made assumptions about what I could or couldn't do based on my file instead of my performance." Gaines considered this, then nodded. "For what it's worth, I think you would have made it through regardless. Even if we'd known your background from day one. You've got something most candidates don't have." "What's that?" "Purpose." Gaines took a drink from his own water bottle. "Most people come here because they want to be SEALs. They want the status, the respect, the identity. You came here because you needed to prove something specific to yourself. That kind of motivation outlasts everything else." Before Isla could respond, Trainee Jackson approached hesitantly. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. He stopped a respectful distance away, waiting to be acknowledged. Isla turned to face him. "Jackson, I owe you an apology." The words came out stiffly, as if he'd rehearsed them, but was still uncomfortable saying them. Not just for the library girl jokes, though those were stupid and I regret them, but for assuming you were weak, for thinking silence meant you had nothing to say, for judging you based on what I thought strength looked like instead of recognizing it comes in different forms. Isla studied him for a moment. "You don't owe me an apology, Jackson. You owe yourself one. I'm not offended by what you thought, but you should be bothered by how quickly you dismiss someone based on surface observations. That's a dangerous habit in this line of work. People you underestimate are the ones who will surprise you when it matters most." Jackson nodded, absorbing the lesson. "For what it's worth, watching you coordinate that extraction was the most impressive thing I've seen anyone do. You made it look easy. It wasn't easy." Isla's correction was gentle but firm. It was the result of years of training and experience and making mistakes in situations where people's lives depended on getting it right. That's the difference between looking competent and being competent. One is performance. The other is earned through repetition and consequence. Jackson extended his hand. "I hope we get the chance to work together. Actually work together, I mean. Not me making jokes while you do the real work." Isla shook his hand. "We will, if we both make it through." After Jackson left, Isla turned back to Gaines. "How bad is the fallout going to be? From the command perspective, I mean." Gaines considered the question. "Honestly, I don't know. You did everything by the book. Your file was complete. You didn't lie about anything. You just didn't volunteer information that wasn't requested. but you also just demonstrated that you can command a multinational operation with about 10 minutes of preparation. That's going to make some people uncomfortable. Because I'm a trainee or because I'm a woman? Probably both. Gaines was direct, not cruel. Some instructors are going to wonder if you should have been fast-tracked to a different program. Some are going to resent that you hid capabilities that could have been utilized earlier. And some are just going to be threatened by the fact that you're better at certain aspects of the job than they'll ever be. And you? What do you think? Gaines looked out at the horizon, where the helicopters had disappeared. I think you did exactly what you needed to do. You proved that competence isn't always loud, that strength isn't always visible, that the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous. Those are lessons every operator needs to learn, and you just taught them more effectively than any classroom lecture could have. The next morning arrived with the usual brutal wake-up call and the usual brutal expectations. But everything else had changed in subtle ways that would have been invisible to outsiders, but were obvious to anyone who'd been on base the previous day. When Isla arrived at morning formation, the other trainees made space for her without the previous dismissiveness. Not deference exactly, but acknowledgement. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer library girl. She was Ravenko, and that name now carried weight it hadn't possessed 24 hours earlier. The instructors ran them through the morning physical training with the same merciless intensity as always. Isla performed at her usual level, neither excelling nor failing, simply meeting every standard with mechanical efficiency. But now, people watched her differently. They noticed that her breathing never became ragged, that her movements never lost precision even as exhaustion accumulated, that she approached each obstacle with the same calm focus that had once been dismissed as detachment. During the afternoon tactical briefing, Colonel Herrick addressed the assembled trainees with his characteristic directness. Yesterday's events have created what I'll diplomatically call an unusual situation. We have a trainee in this program who possesses operational experience that exceeds many of our instructors. This raises questions about how to proceed. He paused, letting the implications settle. After consultation with command, we've decided to continue trainee Ravenko's evaluation exactly as planned. She will complete every phase of Bud S under the same standards as every other candidate. She will receive no special treatment, no abbreviated timelines, and no assumptions about her capabilities beyond what she demonstrates in training. His eyes found Isla in the assembled group. However, we will be utilizing her linguistic capabilities for ongoing coalition operations as needed. This is not special treatment. This is recognition that we have a unique asset that serves national security interests. When she's needed for translation or liaison work, she'll be temporarily detached. Then she'll return to training and make up whatever she missed. Any questions? No one spoke. The policy was clear and seemed as fair as any compromise could be under circumstances that had no real precedent. After the briefing, Isla found herself intercepted by several instructors who wanted to discuss her background more thoroughly. They were professional, not invasive, asking questions about her experience that would help them understand how to integrate her capabilities without compromising the training program's integrity. She answered honestly, providing details about her time in Helmand, her work with various coalition forces, the operations she'd supported from behind translation terminals and radio banks. She was careful not to reveal classified information, but she gave them enough context to understand that her experience was genuine and extensive. One instructor, a grizzled veteran named Morrison, who'd been skeptical of female candidates in general, asked the question several others were thinking but hadn't voiced. Do you think you should be here? Given what you've already done, what you've already proven, do you think you need this qualification? Isla considered the question carefully before answering. I think everyone needs to test themselves against a standard they're not certain they can meet. I've proven I can think under pressure. I've proven I can coordinate complex operations. But I haven't proven I can do the physical aspects of this job at the level required of a SEAL operator. That's why I'm here. Not to validate what I already know, to discover what I'm still capable of becoming. The answer seemed to satisfy Morrison, or at least move him from skepticism toward cautious respect. He nodded and moved on, leaving Isla with the growing awareness that her path through the program had become significantly more complicated, even as it remained fundamentally unchanged. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Isla continued her training, pushing through Hell Week with the same quiet determination that had characterized her first 3 weeks. She didn't excel dramatically. She didn't fail spectacularly. She simply persisted, meeting every standard, completing every evolution, refusing to quit even when her body screamed for rest. And her mind suggested that she'd already proven enough to justify stopping. But periodically, she'd be pulled from training for coalition operations. A French unit needed a translator for a sensitive negotiation. A Korean team required someone who understood both military terminology and cultural context. A joint operation with Pakistani forces needed a liaison who'd worked with them before. Each time, Isla would leave the training environment, complete whatever mission required her unique capabilities, then return to Bud S and resume where she'd left off. The other trainees watched this pattern with mixed reactions. Some resented the interruptions, seeing them as evidence that she was receiving special treatment. Others recognized that she was actually working harder than anyone else, completing both the training and operational assignments that would have overwhelmed most people. A few, the ones paying closest attention, realized that she was demonstrating something important about the future of special operations. Wars weren't won anymore by the strongest or the fastest. They were won by the most adaptable, the most intelligent, the ones who could operate across cultural and linguistic boundaries with the same ease that previous generations had operated across physical terrain. Isla represented that future, and whether the institution was ready for it or not, it was already here. 6 months into the program, during a particularly brutal underwater navigation exercise, Isla found herself paired with Jackson. They had been assigned to locate and retrieve simulated intelligence materials from a submerged training facility, working in zero visibility conditions that required absolute trust between partners. Underwater, rank and background meant nothing. There was only the mission, the limited air supply, and the person beside you. Jackson and Isla moved through the flooded corridors with hand signals and trust, each one covering the other's blind spots, neither one trying to dominate or prove superiority. When they surfaced with the materials, exactly within the time limit, Jackson pulled off his mask and looked at her with something approaching understanding. "You know what I figured out down there?" He was breathing hard but grinning. "It doesn't matter that you can speak 7 languages or that you've been in combat zones. What matters is that you don't quit. That's the only thing that actually counts in this program. Everything else is just noise." Isla pulled off her own mask, water streaming from her hair. "Took you long enough to figure that out." They climbed out of the pool together, part of the same exhausted, determined group of people trying to become something more than they had been when they started. The final phase of Bud S came with the same grinding intensity as everything that had preceded it. Land warfare training, advanced tactics, specialized skills. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities to fail, new reasons to question whether continuing was worth the cost. Isla persisted. Not because it was easy, not because she had anything left to prove to anyone else, but because she'd started something, and finishing it mattered. The training had stopped being about validation and become about completion. She would earn this qualification not because it changed who she was, but because it represented a promise she'd made to herself when she'd first decided to come here. On a morning that felt like any other, Colonel Herrick assembled the remaining candidates who'd survived every phase of the program. They stood in formation, exhausted and transformed, waiting to hear whether they had met the final standard. Herrick walked down the line, looking each candidate in the eye. When he reached Isla, he stopped. For a moment, they regarded each other across the gulf of rank and experience and mutual respect that had developed over months of watching her refuse to quit. "Welcome to the program, Operator Ravenko." Herrick's voice was formal, but his expression carried approval. "You've earned this, not because of what you could already do, but because you proved you could do everything we asked, every time we asked it, without compromise or excuse." The words settled over her like a physical weight finally released. She'd done it. Not by hiding who she was, though that had been part of the strategy. Not by leveraging her background, though it had emerged anyway. But by simply refusing to accept that silence meant weakness, or that quiet competence was less valuable than loud confidence. The graduation ceremony 3 weeks later brought together families, friends, and officials to witness the transformation of candidates into operators. Isla stood among her class, wearing the uniform she'd earned through persistence rather than shortcuts, accepting congratulations from people who now understood that strength came in forms they hadn't been trained to recognize. Captain Rashid attended, having traveled specifically to witness her graduation. When he shook her hand, his grip carried the respect of someone who'd seen her operate in two different contexts and recognized that both required courage of different kinds. Your mother would have been proud. His words were quiet, meant only for her. Your father, too. They spent their lives serving in ways most people never knew about. You've honored their memory by insisting on earning recognition the hardest possible way. Isla accepted the compliment with a small nod, uncomfortable with praise but unable to deny the truth of what he'd said. Her parents had taught her that service meant showing up regardless of recognition, that competence was its own reward, that the people who needed to know your capabilities would recognize them without you having to announce them. In the weeks that followed, Isla's new assignment took her back into the world of coalition operations and multinational coordination. But now she went with different credentials, different authority, different standing. She was no longer just a translator or liaison. She was an operator who happened to speak 7 languages, someone who could move between worlds with equal competence. The trainees who'd once called her library girl heard stories about her performance in the field. The instructors who'd predicted she'd wash out found themselves using her as an example during lectures about adaptation and persistence. The base that had once overlooked her now told her story to new candidates as proof that the quiet ones sometimes surprised everyone. But Isla herself remained fundamentally unchanged by the recognition. She still approached each mission with the same methodical calm. She still sat alone during downtime, reading books in languages most people couldn't identify. She still moved through the world with the understanding that competence didn't require announcement, that capability spoke for itself to those who mattered. On an evening 6 months after graduation, she found herself back at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center, this time as an instructor giving a guest lecture on coalition operations and cultural intelligence. The current class of Bud S candidates listened with the tired intensity of people in week 4, still learning whether they had what it took to continue. Isla stood at the front of the briefing room and looked at the assembled faces, seeing in them the same doubts and determination she'd carried through her own training. She knew some of them would wash out. She knew some would surprise themselves by succeeding. She knew they were all being tested in ways that would reveal character more than capability. The most dangerous assumption you can make as an operator is that strength looks a certain way. Her voice carried across the room with quiet authority. You'll work with people from dozens of countries, from different backgrounds, with different approaches to the same problems. Some will be loud, some will be quiet, some will match every stereotype you've been taught. Others will shatter your expectations. She paused, letting them absorb the lesson. Your job is to recognize capability regardless of how it presents itself, to value competence over confidence, to understand that the person who saves your life might not be who you expected. Intelligence matters as much as physical strength. Cultural understanding matters as much as tactical skill, and the ability to adapt matters more than everything else combined. The candidates listened, some understanding immediately, others filing the information away to be understood later when experience gave it context. Isla saw herself in their faces, remembered being where they were, knew that words could only convey so much before reality had to teach the lessons that mattered most. After the lecture, as candidates filed out, one young woman lingered. She was small, quiet, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of candidate who probably heard daily speculation about how long she'd last. She approached Isla hesitantly. "Ma'am, I wanted to ask, how did you deal with people assuming you'd fail?" Isla considered the question, seeing in this young woman echoes of her own journey. "I used their doubt as motivation. Every time someone predicted I'd wash out, it reminded me why I was there. Not to prove them wrong, though that was satisfying, but to prove to myself that I could do something difficult regardless of what anyone else believed." The candidate absorbed this, then asked the real question she'd come to voice. "Did it ever stop bothering you? The dismissal? The jokes?" "No." Isla was honest. "It always bothered me. But I learned that being bothered and being stopped are different things. You can feel everything they're making you feel and still show up the next day. That's not about being strong enough to ignore pain. It's about being determined enough to continue despite it." The young woman nodded, something in her expression, suggesting she'd found the answer she needed. She thanked Idla and left, walking with slightly straighter posture, carrying the knowledge that someone had walked this path before and survived. Isla watched her go, then gathered her materials and prepared to return to her current assignment. The base had changed since her time as a trainee, but the fundamental challenges remained the same. People still had to prove themselves. Standards still had to be met. And somewhere in every class, there was probably someone being underestimated who would surprise everyone if they just refused to quit. The sun was setting as she walked across the compound toward the parking area. The obstacle course stood empty in the fading light, waiting for tomorrow's candidates to test themselves against its challenges. The barracks were quiet during this brief window between training and lights out. The whole base had the particular stillness of a place preparing for another cycle of transformation. Isla paused near the beach, looking out at the ocean that had witnessed thousands of candidates discovering their limits or transcending them. The water was calm tonight, reflecting the orange and purple sky in patterns that shifted with each wave. She'd spent hours in that ocean during her training, learning that persistence mattered more than preference, that completing the mission mattered more than comfort. She thought about her parents, about the paths they had walked serving in, ways most people never acknowledged. She thought about Captain Rashid and his team, about the 12 men who'd lived because she'd understood a message others would have missed. She thought about the young woman who'd just asked about dealing with dismissal, about all the people who would face similar challenges and need to find their own reasons to continue. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the people who did extraordinary things without ever demanding recognition for them. Those were her people, the ones who understood that competence was its own reward, that service meant showing up regardless of applause, that the most important victories were often the ones nobody else witnessed. Isla turned from the ocean and walked toward her vehicle, ready for whatever mission came next, carrying with her the knowledge that she'd earned her place through persistence rather than shortcuts, that she'd proven what she'd needed to prove, and that somewhere, someone else was just beginning their own journey of being underestimated and surprising everyone. If you know someone who's earned respect through quiet persistence rather than loud declaration, honor them by sharing their story in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with you, consider subscribing so we can continue exploring the truth that strength comes in forms we're not always trained to recognize, because the people who change the world aren't always the ones making the most noise.